Hello, everybody, and welcome to Evolving Stormland. I'm Mike Daly, and this is my partner in crime, Duncan Moore.
Welcome.
So I'm a lead designer at Insomniac Games. I've been there for 6 years, and most recently, I have been the lead designer on Ratchet Clank for PlayStation 4, and our two previous VR titles, Edge of Nowhere and The Unspoken.
I am a principal designer. That is a designer that doesn't want to be a manager. I've been in Insomniac for 14 years. I've worked on a decade's worth of Ratchet and Clank games, and recently our two latest Oculus titles, which has been really fun.
So today we're going to be talking about our latest game, Stormland, currently in development. And Stormland is a game where we wanted to bring full agency in traversal to VR. You play as an android who has traveled to an alien planet to help make it habitable. When you get there, you discover that the planetary storm hosts the remnants of a civilization that had mastered the clouds. You were followed there by a malevolent organization called the Tempest that decimated the settlers, broke your body, and now seeks to exploit the Stormland for their own gain. You mysteriously reboot after decades of inactivity and have to travel upwards, repair your body, build it beyond its original design. You need to find, rescue, repair your android friends, and mount a resistance against the Tempest. So at the heart of the game, the kernel from which everything sort of grew out was solving this problem of traversal, like I mentioned. Once freedom of movement is enabled, that naturally leads to creating a setting that warrants exploration, interesting shapes to move around on, and interesting things to discover in those shapes. Once exploration is present and you get that sense of discovery, exploration is made more interesting, dramatic, and dynamic through a layer of danger. And that's where using your traversal abilities to overcome challenges, using stealth, gunplay, and exotic abilities that you've built into your body to overcome powerful enemies comes into play.
So we'll be referring to a couple of our previous VR titles. Edge of Nowhere was a third-person action horror game with light traversal, stealth, and combat mechanics and systems. The Unspoken is a first-person PvP-based magic dueling game in the arcane underground on the streets of Chicago.
So I think we're good on context now. What's this talk all about? We're going to sort of cover topics in two main chapters. One is, what have we learned from our past games, VR and otherwise, that let us make fun, smooth, fluid VR action, focused around combat and stealth? The second chapter is the same sort of thing. What are our discoveries through prototyping and experimentation and through just like past layout lessons that apply to VR that enable exploration? These two facets make up the core gameplay of Stormland. So to start with, when it comes to tips and tricks for combat and stealth, this is going to mainly center around ways in which we sort of break from the convention of a totally intuitive one-to-one simulation in order to make the player's experience smoother and more fun. So there are a lot of good reasons to sort of cheat the simulation in the player's favor. For example, it can make the player feel more powerful, which is an important feeling for making a game enjoyable. If you've ever played the original Halo alongside a contemporary that didn't have the same auto-aim innovations, you can tell that in one, you feel like a powerful warrior that can fight against an army, and in the other, you feel like an incompetent idiot that can't hit the barn you're standing next to. So feeling powerful is important. Cheating really helps with that. The second big category is reducing friction. If you've ever played like an intense platformer and missed that long jump by 1 pixel and fallen in the pit, you've probably felt this sensation or maybe watched somebody else go through this sensation of like, I jumped, I made that jump. So If your game isn't all about getting just the right timing for that jump, this is an opportunity to cheat and say, like, hey, you hit jump when you're over the pit, but last frame you were on the ground. We'll give it to you, just so that you don't get that frustration. And the third big reason to cheat is to increase dramatic tension. Like, the effectiveness of any gameplay setup is sort of proportional to what sort of emotional response it evokes in the player. And dramatic tension is a big part of that. My go-to example for this is the original Mario Kart game, just because it's so blatant that the game is cheating. But it makes perfect sense. Every player, in order to have fun with it, needs to feel like they have a chance at getting first against the computer. But if the computer drivers were consistent and predictable, that means there's this threshold where people who are better than that will always get first, no problem. People who are worse than that will always struggle. And so they implemented rubber banding, and the result is that there's always this tension that, like, this guy's right on my heels, or I'm like right behind him, and you don't really know what's going to happen until the very end. All right, so hopefully I've convinced you that there's plenty of good reasons to cheat the simulation, but you need to figure out the right time to do it. And in order to do that, you need to understand what's fun about your game. So you should not use cheats to rob the player of their satisfaction. In the example I gave before, if your game is about precision platforming, they'll probably be tuned in enough to know that you're cheating, and that breaking the veil makes it all moot and defeats the purpose. So what you're looking for is a case where the player's intent is unambiguously implied by the game state, because ultimately the player's got this internal idea of the outcome of the action they're trying to perform. And you are trying to predict what the outcome they want is, and just sort of like nudge them to achieve that intended outcome. Now, in order for them to feel like they were the ones that did it, you can't be super obvious about it. And the way to not be super obvious about it is to look at parts of the game simulation that are on the periphery of the player's focus. So always be aware of what you expect the player to be paying attention to. So that's sort of, in broad strokes, my philosophy on cheating. And now, a little bit later on, we'll jump into some specific examples.
Moving on to guns. So Insomniac has a long history of creating fun, combat systems. We love to create inventive weaponry. This is something we want to bring to Stormland. We're really excited to develop for Stormland. We wanted to solve first the problems of how to take combat, how to take weaponry into VR and make it really satisfying in first-person VR, which is a thing that was kind of new to us. We knew how to make guns. We didn't know how to make guns in VR yet. So I'll show a quick video of the weapon we first developed, which was kind of a simple ballistic weapon that we kind of understood. We narrowed the problems we wanted to solve to what makes this feel really good in VR. So this is the SMG. All right. I think all those rocks are dead. They're gone. So the SMG, just trying to get this one gun right taught us a lot of things about how to make weaponry in VR feel really great. Making guns feel good is all about feedback and letting the player understand that they are doing the right thing and they feel empowered by weaponry. So I'm just going to kind of go through some of the key components that we discovered in making this gun. First of all, VFX and sound effects. We put a lot of emphasis on bullet trails and hit effects in the environment to make sure you really understood where your bullets were flying and what they were hitting. It's not so obvious, but in VR, that's a harder thing than you would think to get across because you don't have the clear reticle, the 2D screen that you rely on in so many 2D or console PC-based shooter games. In VR, especially with this weapon that was not so much about like iron sights, it took a little bit more to describe like where you were actually shooting and make that communication very solid for the player. Next thing, animation kickback. So we want really snappy, responsive animations on weapons. We also want to kind of make you feel that recoil as the topmost thing with a powerful weapon like the SMG. So we have animation that actually drives the hand position in the game. One of the things we try and do for the most part is keep your hands in the real world connected to your hands in the game. But this is kind of a place where we can let the SMG push your hands back and disconnect for just a moment just to get that feeling of recoil in the weapon. So that worked out pretty well. Haptic feedback, really important to give little bursts of rumble each time you fire the weapon. And because in our game you're holstering weapons, we need to use haptic feedback to describe where that holster is. So when you put your hand next to your holster, you're feeling that feedback. That gives you a lot of confidence that you can grab the gun, pull it out, use it. Impact and enemy animations. Enemy animations and hit reacts are like one of the topmost things that make weapons feel effective. You want to really understand that when you're shooting that dude, he's like taking damage. So we put a lot of effort into making those things feel great. Especially death animations where you have to have a really fast read that the enemy is dead. You don't want to waste bullets on a guy that's doing this like theatric animation of his death. So that stuff should be snappy. Form and fidelity. In VR, you can look at the guns up close and inspect them and look at them from all angles. So we put a lot into making that gun look and animate really well. And as far as form, we had a lot of issues with like stocks. I mean, you imagine a gun with a really cool stock, but it doesn't really work so well with shoulders and eyes as you're putting guns close to your face. So we kind of have like a stock-free rule with our weapons, which we can pull off because we have more futuristic sci-fi weapons. Secondary fire. What can you have two hands in VR, so you can use this in weaponry in a really cool way. And in just playing around, we found that like grabbing a secondary grip with your other hand was a really nice way to put the gun into like an alternate fire state. So that turned out to be a really kind of cool thing, and we took advantage of it. Aim indicators, like I said earlier, with this gun especially, we're not asking you to use iron sights all the time. So we need like an aiming laser and a point drawn in the world on geometry that just helps you understand like where your bullets are going to be going. So those are really important.
All right. So what you're seeing here is a clip from the Unspoken, our magician dueling game. One of the weapons in the game was the spectral knives, which is the closest that game has to a gun. More or less, you pull back the trigger, you get an aim indicator. You put that laser wherever you want the knives to go and release, they go there. So when we developed this, it felt great, and players really liked it because it afforded a lot of precision, more so than a lot of the other sort of more throwing actions in the game. The ability to put your knives exactly where you wanted them was sort of like unique, cool. It gave the weapon personality. But it also introduced some problems. So unlike guided weapons or weapons that you throw, this gets proportionally more difficult to aim the further you are away from the target. Additionally, as a PvP game, adrenaline starts pumping and your hand starts shaking. It becomes harder and harder to maintain steady aim and do a good job with it. And so this resulted in sort of a wide discrepancy of effectiveness. Some players who had really stable hands and sort of had that skill and precision could play the class effectively. Other players who could play plenty of other classes effectively couldn't. And that gap in accessibility motivated us to try and sort of solve this problem. And so what we did was we introduced a thing called aim magnetism, which is sort of a subtle break from one-to-one hand tracking that allows you to turn narrow misses into barely hits. So as you can see, I'm sort of like scanning my hand across this target as smoothly as I can. As it approaches it, it sort of bends into the target and then sort of blends out as you sweep past it. So the nice things about this are that it's not animated over time, and there's no jumps, so you still actually can place the knives anywhere in space that you want. You just need to use more precision in the halo around the enemy, because what would have been a near miss sort of gets bent in to be a sure hit. And as you play the game, unlike a lot of other cheats, you can actually subtly feel the effect of this, which we thought was a net positive because it gives you that positive reinforcement that, like, you've done it. The aimer is over the enemy now because you sort of felt that little nudge. So another little cheat that helps make weapon aiming a little easier is sort of a cheat to help lead targets. We like to have our bullets go a little bit slower than reality because being able to see it cover the distance over a few frames gives you that sense of velocity and speed, and it sort of like looks a little bit more dramatic. But just that slight slowness of bullets is just enough to where a medium to long range enemy who's strafing might strafe out of the way of the bullet. This is sort of exacerbated by the fact that players' intuitive notion of how to track a target is to try and point the weapon straight at it, and your brain has sort of a little bit of lag to it, to where you're trying to catch up and it's hard to overcompensate. So in the clip here, I'm like trying to chase that target, but my aimer's generally on its left side because there's that aim lag. And if you look closely, almost every tracer that comes out is to the right of my aiming laser, because more or less what the game does is it says, there is an enemy somewhere in your cone of fire. That enemy is moving. Look at how far away it is and how fast it's moving to determine how much you need to tweak the aim vector to compensate for that motion. So that lets what would be a miss because you're sort of failing to track the target when you feel like you're doing everything you should to track the target, turn into hits. There are some side effects of this, like you need to make sure to put a cap on the angle that you tolerate, because some special situations of enemy movement can lead to large instantaneous velocities. And if you don't account for that, you can get bullets coming out of your gun sideways in a highly noticeable way. So one example would be you throw a grenade, you're shooting the guy, the grenade goes off and his hit react to the grenade in order to be dramatic and exciting, has him blow back. And if you're shooting him, you don't want a bullet to be like, whoa, he's going 100 miles an hour, I gotta go that way. So iron sights is something that is pretty cool to do in VR, but there are some trade-offs to it too. I don't know if you've ever played a VR game and tried to line up sort of the 2 pips on the back of your pistol with the 1 pip on the front. Your focus is very much about let's get this orientation just right, layered on top of, let's get that middle pip over the target. It's pretty tough. In Stormland, we were okay with that feeling of satisfaction from a super precise iron sights shot not being a part of the equation because there's so many other things going on with combat. We wanted to make the success rate of an iron sights weapon comparable to the success rate of the SMG you saw, where you can just sort of spray and get a lot of hits. So we implemented 2 mechanisms to solve this. The first you can see here is the sniper rifle, and it's pretty straightforward. You put a rendered scope on it with a dot, and since the scope reflects what's down the gun barrel, there's no question about where exactly the bullet's going to be. Now, unfortunately, a big trade-off with this is you have to render a 3rd viewport, but getting that to perform optimally is out of the scope of the discussion, so you'll have to use your imagination on that one. The one that's a little bit more subtle and interesting, and obviously a lot more temp, is called eye magnetism. So for our battle rifle, it's a shorter range weapon than the sniper rifle. We don't want to zoom in with the scope but we still want you to be able to make precision shots. So what's going on here is we've sort of got these augmented reality iron sights. These are little holograms that show up on the weapon that tell you where the front, back, and middle of the scope is. And in order to aim the weapon accurately, you just got to get the crosshair in the center of the circle. Now what we're doing is taking the vector between one of your eyeballs to that center crosshair and saying that as the weapon gets closer and closer aligned to that, we think it's more and more likely that you're trying to shoot down the iron sights. So once it gets a certain threshold close, we do something similar to aim magnetism and start to blend the aim vector of the weapon to align to that eye vector. And in this case, there's sort of an inner radius that says once you've gone within this radius, it's locked and you have a perfectly aligned shot. So that makes the range that you have to hold your hands a lot more generous, and so that you can focus much more on just getting that pip over what you want to get to, rather than doing that while the inner circle and the crosshair are sort of perfectly aligned. And you can sort of see what the tolerance is by watching the hands as the weapon moves around. The near hand, because this is like an early sort of temp thing, sort of desyncs from the handle, because when the weapon locks into place, the hand moves and the weapon does not.
Okay, so in Stormland, you can shoot guys, you can blow robots up, but we also want you to be able to handle combat encounters in stealthy ways. So we've kind of, stepping back, looking at some of the stuff we've developed on the edge of nowhere, we're trying to bring some of those stealth systems into Stormland. This is an example of lessons we learned in Edge of Nowhere about players' understanding of 3D space and the challenges we had in trying to communicate an abstract like volume of enemy awareness so that players could understand where they're safe and where they may trigger enemies. In a stealth encounter, it's super important that those things are very clear. You don't want a lot of frustration. So in the Edge of Nowhere, we took enemy awareness and kind of mapped it to the ground. So you had a very clear visual indicator on the ground of the enemy awareness. And because this was a third-person game, you could see your avatar in front of you and clearly see where you were standing versus the enemy awareness zone. And it worked pretty well to give you just a very clean system for knowing where to wake up enemies, how to avoid enemies. Some of the cheats we did behind the scenes are based around, we had a very linear game in the Edge of Nowhere where you would walk past an enemy setup or an enemy that's kind of patrolling around. You'd feel like you succeeded, you got to a safe point. But these guys were like operating behind you, so you didn't really always know what was going on behind your back. And we had to do a couple of cheats so that enemies who were still patrolling behind you their awareness was kind of dialed down. They weren't quite as alert as they would be otherwise. And this is, a place where I think it's perfectly acceptable to kind of lean towards what is fun as opposed to what is exactly realistic in your system. So we did some cheating there so players just could get past setups and not get, stabbed in the back all the time.
So when we moved into sort of like 360 free rotation, free roaming for stealth in Stormland, we sort of lost one of the elements that was super effective in Edge of Nowhere, which was very intuitive cover points, which we typically put at the beginning of a setup and sort of within a setup. The usage of cover built into the layout becomes less effective when you can approach at any angle because it's much harder to assess what is going to be valid cover and which enemies will I be blocked from for that. So we found kind of a cool solution that solves a lot of problems at once and has a few benefits that came in the form of stealth grass. It's just really tall grass, so it stands out in the environment. You can approach from any angle. It doesn't hinder your movement. In the grass's shader, it naturally sort of pushes away from you, so being surrounded by it gives you a little bit of sort of a VR moment where you feel like you get to get close to the environment a little bit. And in the simulation, it basically acts like as a binary sort of stealth mask. If you're in the grass, you sort of feel safe because visually there's this layer of obstruction. And enemies won't detect you if they weren't already aware of you. Of course, if you start like shooting your guns, then the gig's up and you're unprotected. But we feel like stealth grass works pretty well because it makes it much easier to read where can I be in this setup in a safe way? How can I approach the enemies? So another thing that makes stealth a little bit difficult when mixed with a game that has a lot of combat is that good feeling combat has you taking down a lot of enemies. It feels very satisfying and rewarding. But good feeling stealth has you understanding the movement and perception of the enemies and getting around it. Your ability to sort of track people that can detect you in stealth caps out at about 3 or 4, which means these two desires are at odds with each other. And so I've got a video here I'm going to show you that demonstrates one of the solutions we have in Stormland. So I've been detected. In comes a dropship and deploys reinforcements. It's a pretty simple concept. The idea is just have few enemies in the setup when the player has the option of going in stealth. If they opt to go in stealth, everything is fine. But if they opt to solve it via the combat route, find a way to introduce more enemies to make things more interesting. In this case, we saw the drop pod pop in and deploy some drones. That sort of forced me to leave my perch because I just don't have enough of those rare sniper bullets to shoot down every guy. But in other cases, entire dropships might come down and drop foot soldiers, which might be worth that bullet spend. And additionally, there could be sleeping soldiers in the setup that get activated when the alarm is triggered. By having an explicit alarm built into the setup, you can also sort of provide an implicit mini objective to the player to make sure that button doesn't get hit.
Okay. So another staple of Insomniac Games, a thing that we've always loved, is traversal. And this is something that we've wanted to add to Stormland for a long time. It's one of the key kind of pillars of the game that we wanted to develop. And that is like, how do we make exhilarating, fun, thrilling traversal systems in VR? I think everybody who loves VR knows that we kind of want to move beyond teleporting everywhere. And so we've just kind of gone crazy and created a system where you can slipstream everywhere. You can glide over this sea of clouds. You can create ramps, jump, glide, do all this fun stuff. In trying to find this mechanic, we went through a couple of prototypes. We started off trying out like Superman flight. We knew that we wanted to use your hands as one of the big drivers for like acceleration and speed. Superman flight was a little bit too free. It wasn't constrained enough. It was kind of hard to build a world around that. We tried like Iron Man controls, which was actually really cool. You felt like you kind of, your hands were propelling you. You felt like you were almost using like a jetpack. That stuff was super fun, but it was also not as like fast and thrilling as we wanted. We kind of took little pieces of every prototype and created slipstreaming. It's driven by your hands for speed. We feel like that's kind of the most comfortable thing in VR to really understand how your body maps to the movement in the game. So hold your hands out, you speed up, pull your hands in, you slow down. We put a lot of work into making gliding over collision feel really great. So you can like slide up onto a beach and it just feels like you've arrived, and it just feels great.
So once you could get up high, we found that getting back down, not so great by default. This was a great opportunity to take the lessons we learned with our slipstreaming prototypes and apply them somewhere else. So gliding, more or less we found that stepping off of a cliff and instigating, like gradually transitioning into a slow fall was pretty comfortable. Like players didn't feel that like stomach lurch when they had a chance to figure out what it was that was going on. And more or less, as soon as you start moving your hands, you realize that you're just going in the direction that you move your hands. You can pitch down or up, you can strafe left or right. It's all very intuitive and sort of complements any learning that you've done on slipstreaming.
So slipstreaming was kind of the first traversal mechanic we prototyped. We wanted to do climbing for a while, and we kind of thought it would be like a minor element of our traversal formula. But once we started playing with it, we realized it had a lot of potential to be just super awesome. And I think we had also all played Breath of the Wild recently and just loved that game. One day we're like, well, we had this kind of climbing mechanic, and we're like, what happens if you just climb everything? At first, we were kind of constrained to certain surfaces. And once we kind of opened that gate up, it really became a lot of fun. I'll just show a quick video of our climbing system at work and then kind of go through some of the pointers that make it. Okay, so in trying to allow us to climb everywhere, creating this buffer that you see was one of the key things that allowed that to happen. So, when you're grabbing onto something, there's a little bit of a space between your hands and the surface, and that allows you to kind of get some distance from the objects. You're not pressing your face into all of the art. You're able to deal with irregular surfaces, natural structures like rocks. We have a lot of rocks in our game because we love to build rocks. The speed of climbing, we found the most comfortable thing was really trying to stick with a one-to-one motion with your hand movement. We tried like adding speed multipliers when you were just gripping a surface and moving, and it started to create a little bit of discomfort. So when you climb, your hand motion is one-to-one, but you can speed up climbing by flinging, which is a thing that we just love. I don't know, I was just flinging throughout that whole video constantly. Flinging, grab, pull, release. We add a speed multiplier based on how fast you released, and it just feels awesome. Flinging also kind of helps you get over ledges. This is probably one of the trickiest things we've dealt with, is how to clear that vertical to horizontal threshold. And so when you fling, we kind of do a little bit of momentum boost over ledges to kind of help you land confidently clearing ledges. And rewards, what is climbing for if not to find cool things? So we're adding lots of fun loot and things to find in the world as you climb up rocks and towers and all this stuff.
All right, so when it came to creating a world that was compatible with sort of these motion mechanics, we found a few things that did not work so well. So these are things to stay away from if you want to have sort of full freedom of movement. For one, you can't necessarily count on the player going through a specific sequence of events. So as much as possible, to the extent that you can, allow for flexibility in the order in which players complete things. In addition, it can be tempting as a designer to try and craft like a very specific space that is dependent on an approach path. It lets you get sort of the composition just right. And it can be a little bit of a trap to block off all the stuff around that. But the player is in the game because they want to go and approach things however they want. So sort of don't rob them of that agency and try your best to make something that's compelling from every direction. Additionally, try and keep your walking ground as flat as possible. Unexpected bumps and dips, like if you're walking over a little rock or a cable, eventually builds up and adds to discomfort, and just generally is not too fun. Which sort of a natural extension of that is going up stairs, going up steep ramps. We found that either make something clearly something you've got to climb up, or make it like very smooth and gradual.
So some of the things that do work with our open world, we build the world in the round. Stormland is kind of composed of an array of islands. All these islands are things that we can dynamically kind of swap out and change to make the world feel different really quickly. And we want people to approach these islands from any direction and give them a lot of agency so they can slipstream, they can jump, they can climb. So we build our world to support that. We try to think of pathing in like a nodal sense so that we have a point of interest on an island. We have many different paths that kind of lead you to that instead of trying to create this one golden path. And as far as how the larger world is constructed, like I said, we kind of have a whole bunch of these islands we can kind of string together to create interesting spaces and then rearrange them pretty quickly, which makes the game pretty flexible. Some of the key components to make these kind of layouts work. These are just key devices that we've found work pretty well. Beaches and structures, you're zipping past these islands pretty quickly when you're slipstreaming, and we want to have a very fast read on the interesting stuff that's going to draw you in. So beaches, high contrast beaches that really catch your eye pretty quickly are important. Having structures and things in the background that look like cool destination points, also very important. Landmarks and funnels are things that, these are like level design devices that everybody has seen, but we try to use them in the open world to really just kind of draw you into the interesting things. We like to use framing devices like arches and line it up so that you'll see cool stuff through that and it just kind of draws you in. When you get to an island, we have pathing that helps you, navigate from like the beach to a point of interest. But we always try to kind of bend and weave that. We try to put obstructions in the way of the pathing so that we're always kind of like teasing you with the thing around the corner instead of creating just long linear paths. Also, having a path gives you a thing to deviate from, which makes climbing feel more interesting when you've gone off the beaten path. Speaking of climbing, even though you can climb everything in the world, you can just go climb whatever rocks you want, whatever buildings you want, it's still very important to create a visual hierarchy so that in the places where there's a real point of interest, players get an intuitive sense that it's a thing that they should visit. Like in this example, you have an orange wall that is a perfect surface to climb. You don't have to climb it, but it kind of communicates the importance of that space. And we kind of cluster detail. We're trying to always draw you into a place of interest. People get turned around in open world games, and especially in the worlds we're kind of creating where there's lots of vegetation, lots of natural things that just kind of look cool. We try to cluster things so you'll have rewards and the most interesting detail in places that are actually important, where you find loot, you find enemies, and all the good stuff that you want. And because you can approach these setups in the round from any direction, we try to create environment objects and let the landscape kind of speak to the gameplay potential of the space using things like natural barriers that may delineate like a safe space from an enemy space, perch points, which are elevated areas that you may find some vertical advantage for using, stealth grass that you'll see around an enemy bunker. So these things hopefully speak to the different gameplay paths you can take in approaching combat setups without being linear and without kind of hitting you over the head with those things.
So sort of to summarize some of the things we've gone over is always keep in mind what you want to be fun about your game. You want to make sure that the game simulation enhances that fun. doesn't rob the player of their satisfaction, that they don't notice that it's going on. Everything from layout guidance to weapon mechanics should feel sort of natural and intuitive. And finally, like in a lot of games, you have a sense that something is going to be cool or fun, but it takes a long time to sort of get there, and a lot of iteration. It can be kind of anxiety-inducing. This game started with this notion of VR traversal, which immediately sets off some flags as, in general, people are very concerned with motion comfort. But this is one of those cases where, from very early on, the game became fun, and that's really like affirming, and it makes it just a real joy to develop. So I think we've hit on something really special here by saying you can go anywhere, you can make a VR traversal game, it can mix with combat and stealth. Really, these things are coming together well, and I think that there is plenty of room in the market for more games like this. So hopefully you've learned something from this and can carry some of these lessons over to your own games.